Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to Locker Room Season, whatever season we're in. I think I've just passed my threshold of remembering what season we're in. Anyway, this season we're talking about some hot button topics. In the first 3 or 4 episodes, we talked about race. And so we're going to continue in the hot button vein today. In case you're new to our podcast, what we do on this podcast is we're trying to redeem men's conversations. This is an unapologetically directed podcast towards men, although I know there's some women out there who listen. That's okay. We're glad to have you. But we're trying to redeem men's conversations, talk about the right things in the right way. And so today what I want to do is do a little thought experiment. Let's pretend you're a father. This won't be hard for many of you. And let's pretend that you have a 13-year-old daughter. Again, probably won't be hard for many of us. All right. She begins to lose weight. Okay. Noticeable amount of weight. And she didn't need to lose any to begin with. And you notice she isn't eating and she thinks she's fat all at the same time. And you, being the common sense parent that you are, can tell that this is a mental health issue, or you suspect that it might be. And it seems to you like classic anorexia. So you and your wife are so worried that you take your daughter to a therapist because clearly her perception of reality and reality aren't aligning. So after her first appointment, you and your wife eagerly await to hear how it went, only to find out that the therapist confirmed your daughter's delusions by affirming her feelings. Your daughter tells you that not only did the therapist tell her that despite what other people say, if she feels obese, she is obese. No one can assign your weight to you. Just because the scale says 80 pounds doesn't mean that you are actually 80 pounds. You see, with no other psychiatric disorder would a good practitioner ever simply comply with and confirm the lies that the patient believes. Yet, and some of you know where I'm going with this, with gender, we do. If a young girl today is taken to a licensed therapist because they think that they are actually a male, even though they're biologically a female, the chances that a therapist will celebrate, affirm, and facilitate irreversible actions are extremely high. So today what I want to do is I want to commend and recommend a book to you for those longtime listeners. You know that sometimes we do these book studies and I recommend books to you. The one I want to recommend today is called Irreversible Damage, the Transgender, Craze, Seducing Our Daughters by Abigail Shrier. Now, I have no idea if Abigail is a Christian or not. I don't think she is, but at the same time, I think every parent simply must read this book. I hope every teacher and school administrator will as well, every counselor, psychiatrist, MD, pastor. Really, I'm saying everybody should read it. What Abigail noticed was that in an astoundingly increasing numbers, young teenage girls were proclaiming that they were trans. And she knew that this was historically not the case. Most cases of gender dysphoria occurred among very young boys. On top of that, the tremendous amount of these cases were among groups of girls, all who knew each other or were at least loosely associated with each other. Something didn't seem right about that to Abigail, so she began to do some research, lots and lots of research. So this is what she learned that you can discover in her book. I'm going to give you a few examples today. Bear with me as I flip through pages. In the introduction, she says this: gender dysphoria, formerly known as gender identity disorder, is characterized by severe and persistent discomfort in one's biological sex. It typically begins in early childhood, ages 2 to 4, though it may grow more severe in adolescence. But in most cases, nearly 70%, childhood gender dysphoria resolves. Historically, it afflicted a tiny sliver of the population, roughly 0.01%, and almost exclusively boys. This is key. Listen to this. Before 2012, in fact, there was no scientific literature on girls ages 11 to 21 ever having developed gender dysphoria at all. In the last decade, that has changed, and dramatically. The Western world has seen a sudden surge of adolescents claiming to have gender dysphoria and self-identifying as transgender. For the first time in medical history, natal girls, she always refers to biological girls as natal girls, are not only present among those so identifying, they constitute the majority. Why? What happened? How did an age group that had always been the minority of those afflicted, adolescents, come to form the majority? Perhaps more significantly, Why did the sex ratio flip from overwhelmingly boys to majority adolescent girls? So she noticed this was happening primarily among white, upper-class, highly educated families, and she wondered why. Listen to this on page 31. She said, I wonder things I don't say aloud, too. Whether this transgender craze isn't partially the result of our overparented, coddled kids desperate to stake out territory for rebellion. Whether it is no coincidence that so many of these kids come from upper middle class white families seeking cover in a minority identity. Or is it the fact that they overwhelmingly come from progressive families raised with few walls they hunt for barriers to knock down? And then there's our modern day obsession with mental health, medicating everyone toward the optimal level of happiness as if we are all just tires in need of topping up. With the help of battalions of therapists, the upper middle class has made a habit of extirpating anxiety, depression, and even the occasional disappointment wherever they find them. Perhaps we've trained adolescents to regard happiness as a natural and constantly accessible state. Perhaps they've come to believe momentary sadness amounts to a crisis, teenage doldrums a catastrophe to rectify rather than a phase to ignore. One thing she talks about throughout the book is that the internet is the grooming ground for this. It's the most consistent feature in every person's story that she shares in this book. And then she talks about, beyond that, what she discovered among the therapists on page 102 and 103, 99 through 101. She says this: the American Psychological Association's guidelines for care of transgender and gender nonconforming patients defines transgender affirming care as the provision of care that is respectful, aware, and supportive of the identities and life experiences of transgender nonconforming people. Respect and support doesn't seem like so much to ask. In fact, it would seem a standard all patients ought to be afforded. But the APA guidelines go much further, mandating that mental health professionals adopt gender ideology themselves. The guidelines state, psychologists are encouraged to adapt or modify their understanding of gender, broadening the range of variation viewed as healthy and normative. By understanding the spectrum of gender identities and gender expressions that exist, and that a person's gender identity may not be in full alignment with sex assigned at birth, psychologists can increase their capacity to assist, make sure I say this right, TGNC, so that's transgender and gender nonconforming patients, their families, and their communities. Imagine we treated anorexia this way. And this is back to my thought experiment, right? A girl 5'6" tall, 95 pounds, approaches her therapist and says, I know I'm fat. Please call me fatty. Imagine the APA encouraged its doctors to modify their understanding of what constitutes, quote, fat to include this emaciated girl. Imagine the APA encouraged therapists to respond to such patients. If you feel fat, then you are. I support your lived experience. Okay, fatty? Or what about a black girl who has internalized the racism of her peers? Suppose Nia, 12 years old, informs her therapist that she desperately wants to become white. She wasn't sure about this for a while, but then she saw these white girls on YouTube who were just so amazing, and that's when she knew that she was supposed to be, what she was supposed to be. Call me Heather, the girl pleads. I want my ugly nose narrowed, she says, and I hate my hair, and I want to be straight and blonde. I want my skin bleached. There are creams, I know, I've read about them. I was never meant to look this way. Anyway, I don't feel black. I find white boys cute. I'm not good at basketball or singing. I'm more into hiking and playing acoustic guitar. I like the TV and food that white girls like. I'm basically white already. Imagine if the therapist said, okay, Heather, nobody knows who you really are better than you. So based on what I'm hearing today, I can absolutely affirm that you are Caucasian. See, sometimes white people are born with black bodies and features. I can bring your dad up to speed on the medical interventions, but even if he doesn't agree, you should know this is a safe space. I will always respect you and who you really are. We'll talk about how to procure those creams at our next session. We wouldn't think such a therapist was compassionate. We might think she was a monster. Nia has offered meaningless stereotypes as evidence that she's not really black. We would expect any half-decent therapist to challenge these ideas she has, to push back on their substance, to expose their source. Who put this rot into this child's head? How had she tragically come to ingest and internalize these racist archetypes? Body dysmorphia has grotesquely exaggerated her features in the image staring back at her from the mirror. The problem's in her mind, not in her face. Race is a far more trivial biological feature than sex. Unlike male and female, of which there are statistically insignificant abnormal variations, race really does admit to a spectrum. So then on page 102 and 103, she talks about more of what she learned by interviewing therapists. She says, in researching the theory and practice of gender affirmative therapy, I spoke with a number of psychotherapists specializing in gender issues, including some who are transgender themselves. More than one told me it was not their job to question an adolescent patient's stated gender identity, but instead to facilitate the patient's range of options. One therapist's website I discovered promises he will never serve as a gatekeeper between patients and their gender hormones or surgeries. He guarantees a same-day first consultation letter of fitness for gender medical interventions. So I'll let you get the book and discover more about the problem we have in many realms. One, with schools not informing parents and conforming to the demands of children in regards to their names, their pronouns, and their chosen identities. Even in some cases, going as far as giving children access to therapy and care that leads to hormone treatments, all without parental knowledge. This is happening under our noses. The chapter in her book on the moms and dads may be the most horrifying I found in the book, which is saying a lot because basically every chapter is horrifying, but parents are being positioned as mean-spirited, bigoted, and narrow-minded, the enemies of children. They are an obstacle to be overcome, not the authority in a child's life. So I guess the question you might be asking is, hey, Scott, this is a men's podcast. Why are we talking about this transgender book? What's the deal here? Well, because many of you are fathers of daughters or will be, and I want to put encouragement out there that you are, in fact, entrusted by God to provide for and protect your daughters. This means that you will have to lead, that you're going to have to be brave, and that you're going to have to advocate for your daughter, perhaps in the face of a world that's gone absolutely mad. I can't think of anything more in line with Satan's agenda than capitalizing on confused teenage girls and rendering them irreparably physically and sexually damaged through the quote-unquote medical interventions that are being employed right now. Fathers can't afford to abdicate their responsibility to the school system, to therapists, or to the online mob of predators seeking to devour our kids. I truly believe this is one of many forms of child sacrifice that the human race has engaged in. So we have to pay attention and lovingly but firmly, don't miss this, firmly point our children to truth and reality. Here's one. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. That's Genesis 1:27. That's the first chapter of our favorite book. In the beginning, God made a male and female, period. And this is a good thing. We are all disordered in some way because of sin. We all have sins and struggles and thoughts and feelings that don't correspond to truth and reality. And our challenge is not to conform to the patterns of this world, to be transformed, rather, by the renewing of our minds so that we can test and approve what God's good and perfect will is. That's Romans 12:2. One last thing I'll say is this, and if you get this book, you'll be overwhelmed with the consistency of the presence of the internet in people's lives who begin to have these struggles, and in almost every story. In fact, I think I could say in every story that she documents in the book, it begins with, or at least somewhere along the way, a young person online being coached, being groomed, and being preyed upon by online influencers, telling them what they need to do and telling them who they are and convincing them that they are not, in fact, the gender that they were assigned, quote unquote, at birth. And so I think it's very important to minimize your child's time on the internet and to constantly and consistently monitor your child's time online. And that's not invasive. That's just called good parenting. And so a lot more we could say about that, but this is basically designed to encourage you to get this book. You can, I'm sure, listen to it if you're not a big reader, but make sure you get it. Irreversible Damage, the Transgender Craze, Seducing our daughters. Thanks for joining us on Locker Room today, and we'll catch you next time.